the story begins with a scene where the world was being overrun by monsters. It was the day the gate to another world opened, unleashing thousands of monstrous creatures. This day marked the moment when the world fell. Amid the countless humans helplessly succumbing to the onslaught, only a small fraction awakened supernatural abilities. These individuals, known as the saviors of humanity, were commonly referred to as players. Among them was a player who began as an F rank but would later become known as the Great Steel Emperor, Lee Hyunwook. He was revered as the last savior of humanity, a title that would come to define him in the memories of those who heard this tale. However, at that moment, Lee was jolted back to reality, reminding himself that his life was a mess and in complete ruins. At the time, he was diligently performing his routine drills alongside other awakened players. The commander of their squad was barking orders, urging them to execute their drills with precision and to avoid slacking off. All humans who had awakened their abilities were conscripted into the anti-monster troops. These individuals, known as players, were tasked with using their newfound skills to serve their country and protect humanity. Lee Hyunwook, while still in an awkward position during his morning practice, found himself questioning why he was in such circumstances if he was destined to become the last savior of humanity. Later, the players remained at the AMT shooting range, their training continuing in the same tense atmosphere. The commander, addressing the group, expressed his disbelief that the strongest humans on Earth had somehow managed to lose track of 9 cartridges. While the commander was speaking, Lee discreetly retrieved a bullet from his pocket using his magic abilities. In a swift and almost imperceptible motion, he directed the bullet toward his mouth and swallowed it. The moment he consumed the bullet, a system notification appeared, informing him that the weight of the metal currently available for manipulation was now 300 grams. Lee listened as the commander berated the players, declaring that they had all lost their minds. Hearing this, Lee silently questioned how anyone could remain in the right state of mind, especially when this was his second time serving in the army. He vividly remembered what the future held. In the end, humanity would face complete annihilation, but it would not be at the hands of the monsters. Instead, it would be the players who brought about the destruction of humanity. As memories of the past flooded his mind, Lee recalled lying on the ground, bruised and battered, teetering on the edge of death. In that moment of despair, a mysterious man appeared before him. The last hero of humanity, the Great Steel Emperor, F-rank Lee Hyunwook, was on the brink of death, powerless to change the course of the current catastrophe. In that dire moment, Lee confessed to the mysterious man that he had never imagined the world would meet its end not because of the monsters but due to the actions of the players themselves. The mysterious man, upon hearing those words, raised his voice, refuting Lee's claim. He declared that Lee was mistaken and revealed that he and his comrades were divine beings who had come to deliver judgment upon humanity. Lee, irritated by the man's words, retorted that neither he nor his comrades were divine beings, they were villains, plain and simple. He declared that if he had only known how to grow stronger a year or even a day earlier, he would have easily killed the man and his comrades without hesitation. The man, hearing Lee's defiance, merely smiled and asked if Lee was frustrated by the situation he found himself in. With a tone of condescension, the man told Lee not to despair, claiming that even if Lee had learned earlier, someone as weak and useless as an F-rank would have died regardless. At that moment, a giant humanoid figure wielding an enormous weapon appeared, its presence casting an ominous shadow. The man turned to Lee, stating that the death awaiting him was the most fitting for someone like him, an F-rank. The towering figure swung its massive weapon with terrifying force, delivering a devastating blow to Lee's head and ending his life instantly. As Lee reflected on the events, he acknowledged that this was how he had died in his previous life. Yet there was one thing he had never anticipated, the chance to regress, as though he were a character in a web novel. Back in the present, the system announced Lee's progress and congratulated him for realizing how to grow stronger. It further informed him that 10 minutes remained until metal absorption would conclude, with the weight of metal available for manipulation currently standing at 300 grams. As Lee processed the system's message, the commander shouted at the group, declaring that he would fix their rotten minds. He instructed the players that when he said 1, they were to respond with soldier, and when he said to, they were to respond with mindset. Without hesitation, the commander began chanting, and the players echoed his commands in unison. Lee, meanwhile, felt a flicker of irritation. Despite his return to the past, his skills had been reset to their starting point, a frustrating setback. However, he resolved to move forward, vowing to reclaim his former abilities and grow even stronger than before. Yet, a nagging thought lingered in his mind. He could not understand why his regression had brought him back to this particular time, forcing him to endure his days in the army once again. As time passed, the day's training eventually came to an end. The players gathered in another location, where the corporal addressed them. He informed the players of Platoon 3, Squad 2, that they were to enter the building. As he continued giving instructions, some of the players who were still waiting began chatting among themselves. One of them mentioned that he had heard the menu for the day would include sausage stir-fry with chicken stew. The news sparked excitement among the group, lifting their spirits. Lee, however, remained disheartened. His regression to the time when he was still undergoing military training weighed heavily on him. He had never imagined he would find himself back in this place, reliving these moments. The corporal, whose name was Oh Sang-guk, eventually called out to the standby squad, which included Lee. He informed them that they needed to complete a task before they could go and eat. Frustrated, Lee pointed out that they had just finished a full day of training. The corporal, hearing Lee's complaint, merely smiled and dismissed it. With a tone of indifference, he replied that he had no knowledge of the standby squad training all day, effectively ignoring Lee's protest. Upon hearing Oh Sang-guk's words, Lee suddenly recalled the past and recognized the man standing before him. It was none other than the infamous army nuisance, Oh Sang-guk, a figure Lee remembered vividly as the embodiment of arrogance and spite. As Lee's memories resurfaced, Oh Sang-guk spoke to him in a condescending tone, addressing him as a loser. He asked if Lee was implying that Oh Sang-guk's squad should be the ones doing the work in Lee's place. With a sneer, Oh Sang-guk added that Lee and his squad, being mere F-ranks who couldn't even level up, had no choice but to take on extra work to compensate for their inadequacies. With an irritating expression, he remarked that this was precisely why Lee was there. Lee recalled how, in the past, he had resigned himself to the belief that he would never surpass the limitations of being an F-rank, viewing himself as a failure. Now, the bitterness of those memories resurfaced. Oh Sang-guk pressed his finger against Lee's forehead and demanded to know if Lee and his squad would take responsibility if something urgent occurred while Oh Sang-guk and his squad were burdened with work. He then warned Lee not to expect any special treatment, even if Lee himself was a corporal. As Oh Sang-guk continued to berate him, Lee's frustration boiled over, and he glared at Oh Sang-guk with a burning intensity. Noticing the look, Oh Sang-guk paused and asked why Lee was staring at him that way, his voice dripping with disdain. Oh Sang-guk demanded to know if Lee wanted to die, his tone menacing as he activated his powers. In that moment, he challenged Lee directly, asking if he wanted to go head-to-head with him. Sang-guk reminded Lee that he was a D rank, clearly asserting his superiority. However, just as Sang-guk was about to make his move, Lee's expression suddenly shifted into a bright, disarming smile. Lee calmly told Sang-guk that he would take on the task assigned to them but suggested that Sang-guk allow them to eat before starting the job. Sang-guk paused, momentarily taken aback by the unexpected change in Lee's demeanor. Lee seized the moment, gesturing subtly to the others around them. He pointed out that Sang-guk's behavior might come across as abusive to onlookers. Lee added that he was concerned such behavior could lead to strange rumors about Sang-guk, tarnishing the reputation of someone who was supposed to be a respectable figure in the future. With a sharp, menacing smile, Lee concluded by telling Sang-guk that he had the potential to achieve great things someday. However, for that to happen, Sang-guk needed to conduct himself in a more appropriate manner. Oh Sang-guk, hearing Lee's response, reluctantly agreed, though inwardly he was unsettled. This was not how he had expected the situation to unfold. Lee then spoke up again, assuring Sang-guk that since it was his order, Lee and his squad would eat quickly and finish the assigned task just as fast. Sang-guk, unsure how to proceed, awkwardly cleared his throat and complimented Lee, telling him he was doing a good job. Turning to the others standing nearby and watching the exchange, Sang-uk barked at them to stop gawking and go eat. Lee, meanwhile, addressed one of his squad members, Park Junwo, and told him to take the rest of the squad to eat, explaining that he himself didn't feel like eating. Park Junwo nodded and complied, leading the group away. As Sang-uk watched them leave, he found himself deep in thought. Something about Lee felt different, as if he wasn't the same person he used to be. The shift in Lee's demeanor left Sang-uk unsettled and unsure of what had just transpired. Moments later, Lee reached a secluded corner, exhaled deeply, and silently congratulated himself for handling the situation well. He thought to himself that dealing with Sang-uk was trivial compared to the looming shadow of Gordon Precy, the man responsible for his death in his first life. The memory of Gordon's countless atrocities resurfaced, filling Lee with frustration and anger. He cursed Gordon bitterly, vowing that things would be different this time. Lee thought to himself that if he continued to cause trouble while stationed there, he would only prolong his stay and risk losing his chance to catch up to Gordon. Resolving to avoid unnecessary conflicts, he decided to keep a low profile for as long as he remained in the military. As he mulled over his plans, the system suddenly appeared before him, informing him that he could now manipulate 1 gram more of steel. It further notified him that the metal absorption process was complete and that the total weight of metal available for manipulation was now 309 grams. Seeing the notification, Lee shifted his focus, determined not to dwell on other distractions. Holding a handful of spoons in his grasp, he reminded himself that under no circumstances could he let anyone discover that he could level up. Back at the cafeteria, soldiers began murmuring among themselves, puzzled about the sudden disappearance of all the spoons. One of the players, noticing the odd situation, called out to Park Junmo, a private, and informed him that there seemed to be a problem. Every spoon in the cafeteria had mysteriously vanished. Meanwhile, outside the cafeteria, Lee stood in a quiet corner, discreetly ingesting the spoons he had taken. He knew that every bit of metal he consumed brought him one step closer to regaining his strength and preparing for the challenges ahead. As Lee continued, the system popped up again, notifying him that metal absorption was about to begin. It informed him that there were 13 minutes remaining until the process was complete, and the weight of the metal currently available for manipulation was 309 grams, with an expected absorption of 1.25 grams. Lee took out his knife and began to assess his options. He thought to himself that his M7 bayonet weighed 140 grams. If he wanted to increase its impact by adding more weight, he would only be able to control a small fraction of it. He also noted that cartridges weighed only 1 gram, while spoons weighed 1.25 grams. At this rate, it would take far too long to regain the strength he had lost before his death. Lee found himself in a dilemma, unsure of how to proceed. Gazing at a monument in the distance, Lee reflected on whether this was the only option left for him to increase his power and level up. He decided that, if it was indeed his only solution, he had 3 days to prepare. With a serious expression, Lee resolved that he would have to face and defeat a boss mob while still at level 1. He knew it would be a difficult challenge, but it was the only path forward if he wanted to regain his strength quickly. As Lee spoke those words, he activated his powers to sheath his knife without physically touching it. A menacing smile crept across his face as he told himself that he would show those who doubted him what it truly meant to be an expert player. 3 days later, at the 3rd Brigade, 1st Battalion Station Namsan, 5th Post, Lee Hyunwook and Park Junmo were stationed as guards during the night shift. As they stood watch, Park Junmo glanced at Lee and spoke up, noting that Lee seemed to have changed recently. Lee, upon hearing this, asked Park if he felt uncomfortable with the change in his behavior. Park, startled by the question, quickly panicked and reassured Lee that he didn't mean anything negative. At that moment, the system appeared before Lee, informing him that he could now manipulate 6 grams more. It also announced that the metal absorption process was complete, and the total weight of metal available for manipulation had increased to 1,359 grams. Park, realizing he had caused some confusion, clarified his earlier comment, telling Lee that what he had meant to say was that Lee had changed for the better. As Park spoke, Lee suddenly turned towards him, catching Park off guard. Surprised by the sudden movement, Park listened as Lee asked if he trusted him. Park, still a bit startled, responded that he did indeed trust Lee. Hearing this, Lee smiled to himself, knowing that the time had come to carry out his plan. Moments later, near the gate from which the monsters would emerge, Lee was engaged in battle. Using his powers, he controlled his bayonet with precision, directing it without needing to physically hold it. He launched the weapon towards the monsters, dealing damage and annihilating them one by one. While fighting, Lee couldn't help but smile menacingly. He thought to himself that he never expected to be so happy to face the monsters again. He had waited 3 long days for this moment. After dealing significant damage to one of the monsters, Lee noticed it was still standing, though badly injured. As he observed it, he thought to himself that he had never failed an ambush before. This, however, was proof that he was still at level 1, and despite his new powers, he was still very weak. While using his bayonet, Lee thought to himself that this was his second chance at life, and he didn't like repeating the same tasks. As the monsters charged toward him, he warned them that if they dropped anything unworthy, they would truly be dead to him. Without hesitation, Lee slashed the head off one of the monsters charging at him, killing it instantly. The remaining monsters, seeing the deadly effectiveness of Lee's attack, became much more cautious. Meanwhile, Lee focused on the monster drop lying on the ground after his kill. He knew the future and understood that consuming steel was key to growing stronger. With that in mind, he used his powers to lift the drop from the floor and ate it. The monster, witnessing this strange act, was confused by Lee's actions. The drop Lee consumed was known as mana steel, and as soon as he ate it, the system popped up to congratulate him for consuming mana steel, a metal from another world. It also informed Lee that there were 24 minutes remaining until metal absorption and that the weight of the metal currently available for manipulation was 1,359 grams. It added that there would be an expected increase in weight after absorption, and mana would also increase as a result. Upon hearing what the system had told him, Lee laughed menacingly as he realized that by consuming everything he came across, life's difficulties in this new reality would become far easier for him. With this newfound understanding, Lee called upon his bayonet once more, pointing it toward the monsters, and declared that the mukbang was about to begin. Before Lee could engage with the monsters, he remembered that Park had placed his trust in him. Lee readied his weapons, and just as a huge roar echoed in the distance, he swiftly silenced Park before he could speak. Lee then slowly informed Park that he could sense the movement of metal. Park, surprised by this, responded that he had assumed Lee could only sense metal that was visible to him, so he was astonished to hear that Lee could sense metal even when it was out of sight. In that moment, Lee thought to himself that what he had told Park was a lie. However, Park then suggested that Lee should report this ability, but Lee quickly dismissed the idea. He explained to Park that the branch office would never believe such a claim, especially from someone like him, an F rank who could sense an invisible and unconfirmed metal. Upon hearing that, Park asked Lee what they should do next. Lee told Park to promise him one thing: he was going to investigate what was happening, and Park should not leave his post under any circumstances. Lee also insisted that Park must not report anything to the higher-ups because Lee knew that if the military found out, they would claim all the weapons dropped by the monsters for themselves. Back in the present, Lee charged toward the monsters. As they prepared to attack him, Lee easily dodged their strikes and countered with his own, slashing at the monsters' legs to prevent them from moving freely. As Lee continued his assault, a monster, seemingly the leader of the group, watched the situation unfold from the rear. Lee, however, didn't stop. He taunted the monsters, encouraging them to keep screaming, as it would only amplify their fear. Then, he shouted at the monsters, revealing that in his previous life, he had been killed by an attack from behind. Furious, Lee warned the monsters that if any of them dared to attack him from behind again, he would devour them alive. The monsters, seeing Lee's fury, began to panic. Lee, noticing their fear, realized that he had instilled enough terror in these unintelligent creatures. He decided it was time to move on to the main course. Looking around, Lee grew frustrated as he tried to locate the boss monster with his own eyes. He wondered where the goblin shaman, the cunning leader of the monsters, was hiding. Unbeknownst to Lee, the goblin shaman was perched high in a tree, seething with rage at the situation. Its subordinates were being easily defeated by Lee, and it was desperate to regain control. Lee, in the meantime, picked up an item from the ground. He thought to himself that he was doing this deliberately, creating an opportunity for the goblin shaman to attack. He knew that the goblin shaman would not miss the chance, and when it made its move, Lee would finally be able to pinpoint its location. At that moment, the goblin shaman took the bait Lee had set and activated its spell. It smiled, thinking to itself that it had finally caught Lee off guard and would end his life. However, Lee, also smiling, knew the goblin shaman had made its move and was about to reveal itself. The goblin shaman launched its spell, and from the ground where Lee was standing, hundreds of spikes shot up. The spikes not only destroyed the area but also killed the surrounding goblins who had been nearby. Elsewhere inside the base, 2 players stationed during the night were still awake. One of them called out to the platoon leader beside him, asking if he had just heard the ground shake. The platoon leader, irritated, asked if his subordinate was scared, warning him that he would kill him if he woke him up again over something trivial. The subordinate immediately agreed, understanding the leader's anger. Back with Lee, the goblins were panicking as they saw most of their comrades killed by the spell released by the goblin shaman. However, the goblin shaman continued to smile menacingly, believing it had dealt with Lee. But just as it was celebrating its victory, a voice suddenly rang out, telling the goblin shaman that it had been found. The voice was none other than Lee's. The goblin shaman was confused. How could Lee still be alive after being hit by its powerful attack? In that moment, Lee launched his attack, sending his bayonet towards the goblin shaman. But the goblin shaman managed to dodge the attack. Lee, acting disappointed for having missed, drew a mocking laugh from the goblin shaman, who taunted Lee for the failed strike. But then, Lee shouted at the goblin shaman, calling it an idiot and revealing that he had missed on purpose. Lee's bayonet knife was then launched again toward the goblin shaman. However, just as the attack was about to strike, Lee was stunned. Not only did the goblin shaman dodge the attack again, but it also caught the bayonet knife with its bare hands. Lee, smiling, told the goblin shaman that he was speechless, impressed by its ability to catch his great sword. He added that it seemed like he had really been a failure in his past life. The goblin shaman, on the other hand, was furious, realizing it had fallen into Lee's trap. Lee then spoke up, telling the goblin shaman that for someone who had sent a whole gang of goblins after him, it had no right to complain about getting a small scratch. He shouted at the goblin shaman, telling it to come down from where it was standing because he was going to slice it and all its subordinates in one go. However, after saying that, Lee thought to himself that he had just bluffed about what he was going to do. As he looked around at the goblins surrounding him, he wondered what he should do next. With the boss now fighting him head-on, and the goblin's spirits high, the situation was much more complicated than he had anticipated. As Lee was thinking about his situation, the system suddenly popped up, warning him that he had consumed mana rapidly in a short amount of time and now had less than 40% of his mana remaining. The system cautioned Lee to be careful when using mana. Lee, seeing this, realized that there was a more pressing issue at hand, his dwindling mana. He told himself that since things had come to this point, he had no choice but to act. He then shouted at the goblin shaman, telling it that if he couldn't consume the shaman, they would both die together. He added that, even if it took time, he would eat the goblin shaman and then head to the guardhouse. The goblin shaman, hearing this, felt confident. It knew that it had the upper hand now and was in a stronger position than Lee. But at that moment, Park Junmo's voice could be heard, shouting for Lee and asking where he was. Lee was surprised to hear Park so close, but the goblin shaman, seeing Park Junmo, immediately ordered its minions to attack him. The goblins rushed toward Park Junmo, intent on killing him. At that moment, one of the goblins launched itself toward Park, catching him off guard. Just as the attack was about to hit him, Lee shouted at Park to get down. Lee then fired a barrage of bullets at the goblins charging toward Park, taking them all down. Once the goblins were defeated, Lee turned his attention to the goblin shaman, but as he searched for it, he realized that the boss monster had already fled. Lee became irritated, knowing that he had missed his chance, and thought to himself that the goblin shaman was more cautious than he had anticipated. At that moment, Lee's walkie-talkie crackled with a voice asking for a report. They had heard the gunshots and needed to know what was going on. Lee, with no choice but to respond, told them he was from the 5th post and that a gate had appeared in the area. He reported that goblins had infiltrated, but after the initial skirmish, the goblins had retreated. Lee then glanced at Park, who was lying on the floor, frightened, and added that there were no casualties. The player informed Lee that they had received his report and instructed the players stationed at the 5th post to remain on standby and defend their position. Upon hearing this, Lee reflected on his past experiences, realizing that someone he wished to avoid involvement in the matter would soon arrive after learning about the situation. Meanwhile, back at the base, an announcement declared a 5-minute standby for an emergency. It was revealed that a gate had appeared in the area. At that moment, a woman prepared to address the situation, the AMT's paladin and lieutenant, Seo Yunha. Lee recalled from his past life that, in this very scenario, Seo Yunha had successfully stopped the gate. Furthermore, she had acquired all the weapons from defeating the monsters and handed them over to the military. Lee vividly recalled that, in his past life, a legendary grade item had been acquired during this event. From that moment on, the item, known as adamantium, belonged to the military. In the past, this ultimate item had earned Lee the title of the Steel Emperor. Reflecting on this, Lee realized that if he missed the opportunity to obtain the item now, the next chance he would have, according to his memories, would be 4 years later. If that happened, the outcome would mirror the past, leaving Lee unable to surpass his previous strength. Determined to change his fate, Lee resolved to claim the item earlier than before. This time, he would secure it before the military could take possession of it, ensuring his path to greater power. Lee pondered the situation, wondering where the goblins might be located. Meanwhile, Park Junwo, after regaining his composure, was struck with terror upon seeing the corpses of goblins scattered on the floor. As Lee continued to analyze the situation, he considered the possibility that the goblins could be in the city center but quickly dismissed the idea. The high population density made it an unlikely hunting ground for goblins, who typically hunted in packs. While Lee was deep in thought, a player reported over the walkie-talkie that they were from the 6th post and were under attack by goblins. Hearing this, Lee smiled to himself, confident he had pinpointed the goblins' location. Without hesitation, he spoke into his walkie-talkie, informing the higher-ups that he was from the 5th post and was heading to support the players at the 6th post. The higher-ups, however, reminded him that he had been ordered to defend his position. They argued that, as an F-rank player, he would not be of much help and should remain at his assigned post. Ignoring their objections, Lee lowered the volume on his walkie-talkie and proceeded with his decision. As Lee prepared to leave, Park Junwo rushed over, grabbing his legs to stop him. Park warned Lee that disobeying the higher-ups' command would not only result in confinement to the guardhouse but could also lead to a military trial. Hearing this, Lee firmly replied that the players at the 6th post consisted only of archers and mages, all specializing in long-range combat. He explained that they would not be able to handle the goblins on their own and would inevitably perish without assistance. Park Junwo argued that nothing would change even if Lee went, as he was just an F-rank player and entirely on his own. In response, Lee declared that he was not alone and, pointing at Park, stated that Park would accompany him. Park Junwo, startled and confused by Lee's sudden declaration, hesitated. Meanwhile, at the 6th post, the players were frantically calling for help, reporting that Corporal Kim Jong-ok was down. The higher-ups informed them that the Rapid Response Unit had been dispatched and ordered the remaining guards to defend their position at all costs. Despite this, the players at the 6th post pleaded for immediate support, insisting that if no action was taken soon, they would all be killed. The goblins were relentlessly attacking the post where the 2 players were stationed. Inside the post, one of the players anxiously checked on Corporal Kim, who had been severely injured by the goblins. Struggling to speak, the corporal weakly informed his subordinate that the barrier protecting them from the goblins would not hold much longer. Hearing this, the subordinate shouted into the transceiver, demanding to know where the reinforcements were and questioning if help would only arrive after both of them were dead. At that moment, the two players noticed an abrupt and eerie silence outside, leaving them confused about what was happening. Suddenly, they realized that all the goblins surrounding the post had vanished. However, standing before them was the goblin shaman. Without hesitation, the shaman activated its magic, unleashing a barrage of rocks aimed at the post to destroy it. The moment the attack struck, the post shook violently, and the two players were gripped by panic, unsure of what was happening or how to respond to the overwhelming threat. As the two players peered outside to identify their attacker, they realized the devastating assault came from the boss monster. One of them spoke in dread, explaining that once the boss destroyed the post, the remaining goblins would capture them, raise them to the altar, and carve out their hearts while they were still alive. The corporal, realizing there was no escape, pulled out his gun and pointed it at his mouth. His subordinate, panicked, asked what he was doing. The corporal replied that ending his life now would be far less painful than being sacrificed to the goblins. Hearing this, the subordinate was left speechless, fully aware that there was little either of them could do to change their fate. Just as despair began to consume them, a voice cut through the tension. Lee announced his arrival, informing the two players that he would assist them from that moment onward. Lee called out to one of the players trapped in the post, Private Park, and instructed him to prepare his bow. Since Park was an archer, Lee directed him to load his bow, use his fire skill, and aim at a light source while standing by for further instructions. Park, however, hesitated and told Lee that a single archer, even at his level, would not be enough to put up a fight. They would typically need an entire unit of archers to stand a chance. Feeling overwhelmed, Park asked what he was supposed to do on his own. He also admitted that he could barely see anything in the darkness, making it impossible to know where to aim. As Park voiced his concerns, he suddenly noticed a faint sparkle of light shining in the distance. Unsure, he asked Lee if he should aim at that light. Standing atop a goblin in the midst of combat, Lee assured him to do so, stating that he would control the trigger. Using his power, Lee took control of the bow's trigger mechanism that Park was holding. Park, startled, watched in disbelief as the trigger began moving on its own, guided by Lee's abilities. In that moment, Lee pulled the trigger, and the arrow shot forward, striking the goblin directly and killing it instantly. The system immediately notified Lee that using mana to control the bow's trigger had consumed 1% of his mana. Hearing this, Lee smiled, realizing he could conserve mana effectively by utilizing this method while still achieving precise kills. He noted that the archer's destructive power was an added advantage. The goblin shaman, witnessing one of its minions being taken down by the players inside the post, activated its magic once more. It launched a barrage of rocks at the post, but despite the relentless assault, the post managed to withstand the attack. However, the barrier protecting it was nearing its breaking point. Lee turned to Private Park and instructed him to reload his bow, emphasizing that the fight was far from over. Park nodded in agreement, preparing another arrow. Lee reminded him to aim for the light once the bow was ready. As the battle raged on, the goblin shaman observed the scene from a distance. It could see its forces being systematically destroyed, and its fury grew with each loss. The shaman's frustration became evident as it prepared for its next move. In another location, Junwo was carefully sneaking behind the bushes, recalling Lee's instructions to locate the boss monster. As he reflected on this task, Junwo couldn't help but feel a growing sense of dread. Even if he managed to find the boss monster, he knew signaling Lee would likely lead to his own death at the hands of the creature. Junwo's gaze shifted to the ongoing battle, and he muttered to himself that Lee had claimed he would only distract the monsters. However, as Junwo watched closely, it was clear that Lee was doing much more than just creating a diversion. He was single-handedly overpowering the goblins and dominating the battlefield. At that moment, as Junwo was lost in thought, a goblin suddenly appeared in front of him. Frozen in fear, he didn't know how to react and silently prayed for someone to save him. Just as the goblin advanced, Lee intervened, skillfully redirecting Park's fire arrow straight into the goblin's head, killing it instantly. Junwo snapped out of his shock, raising his gun to defend himself against the monsters. As he did, he glanced at Lee, wondering if this was truly the same corporal he once knew. Meanwhile, Lee was growing increasingly frustrated. The goblin shaman had yet to reveal itself, and Lee began to suspect it was deliberately staying hidden, waiting for him to exhaust his mana. As this thought crossed his mind, the system alerted Lee, warning that his mana was depleting rapidly. It cautioned him to use his remaining resources wisely, as he had only 12% mana left. Aware of the dire situation, Lee began scanning the area for the goblin shaman, urgency mounting with each passing moment. Suddenly, a voice called out to him. It was Junwo, begging for help. Lee turned toward the sound and saw Junwo being held hostage by the goblin shaman, its hand gripping Junwo's head tightly. Junwo, his voice trembling, apologized to Lee, explaining that he had followed every instruction but had still been captured by the shaman. Lee froze, his gaze locked on the scene, as he assessed the new threat. As Lee prepared to attack the goblin shaman, the creature positioned Junwo between itself and Lee, using the hostage as a shield and threatening to kill him if Lee made any sudden moves. Frustrated by the situation, Lee dropped his bayonet knife and raised his hands in a gesture of surrender, as if giving up the fight. But as his hands were raised, Lee spoke to Junwo, telling him that, in the end, it was because of Junwo that Lee now had the opportunity to kill the goblin shaman. A menacing smile crossed Lee's face as he activated his power, taking control of the trigger on Junwo's gun. Without hesitation, Lee pulled the trigger, sending a barrage of bullets toward the goblin shaman. The attack struck the shaman severely, causing it to release Junwo from its grasp. At that moment, the other goblins attempted to charge at Lee, but he skillfully dodged their attacks. With determination, Lee surged forward, knowing that this time, he would be able to finish off the goblin shaman once and for all. The goblin shaman, realizing the danger, began to retreat toward the gate, attempting to escape. Lee reacted swiftly, launching his bayonet knife toward the fleeing creature. However, the goblin shaman managed to block the attack, its leather armor providing enough protection. Lee was taken aback, surprised that the shaman had been able to defend itself so effectively. In that moment, the system warned Lee again, informing him that his mana was rapidly depleting, with only 9% remaining. It cautioned him to use his mana wisely, but Lee refused to stop. He continued to pursue the goblin shaman, determined not to let it escape. As the goblin shaman reached the gate, Lee pushed himself harder, closing the distance. Realizing he had no other option, Lee used his remaining mana and activated his steel magic. The shaman, wearing a necklace made of steel, was suddenly pulled back toward Lee. Confused, the shaman tried to resist, but each time Lee used his magic, the shaman was dragged closer. With each pull, Lee's mana drained faster, and he realized he had to defeat the goblin shaman before his reserves ran out completely. As Lee dragged the goblin shaman close enough, he summoned his bayonet once more, using the last of his power. Just as the system warned him that his mana had been completely depleted, Lee delivered the final blow to the goblin shaman in the nick of time. Breathing heavily, Lee collapsed momentarily, exhausted from the intense battle. With no mana left, he reflected on the fact that he was still able to use most of his abilities, though he was disappointed that his body couldn't handle the toll like it had in the past. He resolved that he needed to work out to avoid such limitations in the future. As Lee was contemplating this, a yellow light suddenly appeared in the sky. He recognized it as holy light, signaling that Seo Yunha had arrived. Quickly, Lee turned his attention back to the goblin shaman's body, knowing that the legendary item was somewhere inside. After a brief struggle, Lee finally located the item. At that moment, the other players arrived and ordered Lee to raise his hands, threatening to shoot if he didn't comply. But Lee, already holding the item in his mouth, acted swiftly. Before they could react, he consumed the item, swallowing it down as he turned to face them. After swallowing the legendary item, Lee turned to face the others and announced that he was Corporal Lee Hyunwook. Upon hearing this, the players approached to assist him. One of them quickly instructed the others to bring a stretcher to carry Lee, who had been injured while fighting the monsters. They also noted that since the gate was still open, it meant there were still enemies nearby. Seo Yuna, after assessing the situation and observing the surroundings, was surprised that 4 regular soldiers had managed to take down a boss monster. However, as she examined the monster's wounds more closely, she realized that all of them had similar marks. She concluded that it could not have been the work of 4 soldiers but rather the work of just one man. At that moment, the system popped up again and congratulated Lee for consuming the legendary item adamantium. It also cautioned him that the metal was already being absorbed into his body, with a delay in the absorption process. The system informed him that it would take approximately 9 hours and 48 minutes for the metal to be fully absorbed. Lying on the stretcher, Lee smiled, content with the fact that he had accomplished what he had set out to do. The system then informed Lee that the metal he had absorbed was enchanted. After absorption, Lee would develop magic skills similar to the enchantment. It also noted that the expected increase in weight was undeterminable, but both the increased weight and mana might grow rapidly compared to their current levels. Lee, still smiling with satisfaction for accomplishing his goal, didn't notice that Yuna had observed his behavior. She wondered why Lee was laughing in such a situation. At that moment, the system popped up again, congratulating Lee and revealing that a rare ability had been unlocked upon consuming the legendary item. Lee could now detect all metals within his range of control. Upon hearing this, Lee thought to himself that he had finally regained his precious powers. Now, he could sense the resonance of metals around him. In that moment, Lee proudly told himself that this day marked the true comeback of the Great Steel Emperor. A few days after the Barracks Gate incident at the 3rd Brigade, 1st Battalion Station, 2 female players were chatting as they walked. One of them mentioned that she had heard the rumors about the F rank being true. She added that the other players were just waiting to be killed when suddenly an F rank corporal appeared. With a huge sword, he managed to slice up all the goblins. The other player, surprised, responded that it didn't make sense for an F rank to perform such feats. She said that this was real life, not some fantasy, and it was hard to believe an F rank could defeat all the goblins on their own. At that moment, a man spoke up to the group of men around him. The man was Sergeant Oh Sanguk, and he expressed that the atmosphere in the unit was terrible. Sanguk told the others that he wasn't going to believe the rumors. One of the subordinates, Private Park Il, saluted Sanguk and said that the rumors were true. However, just as he finished speaking, a large man grabbed Park by the head. With a menacing smile, the man told Park that Sanguk had not accepted his salute, so Park wasn't allowed to lower his hand. Park, in a panic, saluted Sanguk again, fearful of the consequences if he disobeyed. As he did so, Sanguk called out to the large man, Lee Hyunwook. Hyunwook, a private and a barbarian from the close combat affiliation, was a high-rank specialty in a D rank who had been judged as a C rank. He was known for his ability to rip apart goblins with his bare hands. Sanguk asked Hyunwook if he could take 3 of the players and do a gate raid. Hyunwook, however, responded that there was no way he could do that. Sanguk agreed with Hyunwook's assessment, adding that it was impossible for an F rank to accomplish such feats. Sanguk then expressed that he didn't believe the players had defeated the boss mob on their own. He concluded that the last attack must have come from some of the stragglers who had fallen behind from the herd of goblins. However, Sanguk also noted that if, by some chance, an F rank went wild, it would become an issue for military discipline. He told the others that they couldn't let it escalate into a military problem and needed to address the situation. Upon hearing this, Hyunwook smiled menacingly, knowing exactly how they were going to handle the situation. Moments later, inside the commander's office, Lee stood saluting his superior. As he did, he introduced himself, stating that he was Private Lee Hyunwook and had come because he had business in the battalion commander's office. However, as he spoke, Lee felt a bit troubled. He wanted to avoid causing any trouble and thought to himself that if everything had gone well, and if the previous higher-up hadn't informed the others that Lee had disobeyed the rule to remain at his post, they might have let it slide. He wondered why the higher-ups had called him there. Standing next to Lee was Lieutenant Seo Yunha, known as the Black Paladin, a B-rank player, along with another player, Lieutenant Lee Min-hee, a C-rank wizard. The player standing before Lee then spoke up, asking if it was true that Lee had disobeyed the command to wait and had forcefully repelled the first wave of the gate. The one who asked was none other than the battalion commander, Major Kim Kang-seok, a druid known as Namsan's King of the Mountains. He was a B-rank player, ranked 166 in South Korea. Lee, upon being asked the question, thought to himself that one wrong word could lead to a military trial, so he reminded himself to stay composed and keep things under control, especially at the guardhouse. Lee then spoke up and confirmed that what Major Kim had said was true. He explained that he had seized control of the gate's outbreak while on duty and had responded immediately. Kim, in response, said he had seen the report but was struggling to understand it. Normally, an F-rank player like Lee should have been torn apart by the goblins, so Kim couldn't comprehend how Lee had survived the fight. Lee, observing the intense pressure on the commander's face, thought to himself that if he backed down now, his military career would be in jeopardy. With that realization, Lee decided to take action. He spoke up again, telling the commander that he felt wronged and that he felt as though he had been deceived by Kim's words. Kim, hearing this, was confused by Lee's statement, while Lieutenant Min-hee, hearing Lee's remark, told him that he had no right to speak that way to the commander. However, Kim stopped Min-hee and turned his attention back to Lee, asking why he had said such a thing to him. Lee then spoke up and reminded Kim of something Kim had emphasized during every training session. Lee asked if Kim remembered what he would always say to the players without fail. Kim, surprised by the question, immediately understood what Lee was referring to. He recalled that he had always told the players that regardless of their rank, if they approached the monsters using the AMT's Great Monster Tactical textbook, even a D-rank or E-rank player could face trolls. Lee then added that, according to Kim's training, even though an F-rank like him might struggle against a troll, he should be capable of handling goblins. Lee continued by acknowledging that although he had disobeyed the commander's order to wait, if he hadn't gone to support the 6th post, all of the players would have perished. As he said this, Lee thought to himself that he had made a rational argument and now it was time to make his emotional appeal. Lee spoke again and reminded Kim of something Kim had always emphasized: for a true soldier, there are no ranks. Soldiers must always be prepared for the worst and fight with everything they have. Lee told Kim that just as Kim had advised them, he had done the same. As a soldier under a battalion commander he respected, Lee had followed Kim's guidance to the letter. He explained that he had taken the tactics they learned during their difficult training to heart and did his best to carry out the strategy, with his life on the line. Lee added that the only reason he had been able to endure his military life, despite being mocked and looked down upon as an F-rank player, was because of the true military mindset he had learned from Kim, the battalion commander. That belief was the only reason Lee was still standing strong. Lee told Kim that to see him deny the results of that belief felt like Lee's entire military life was being dismissed. This, he said, was why he felt like he had been scammed by the commander. Lee then thought to himself about Kim Kang-seok. When Kim was appointed as a 2nd lieutenant, the gates had started opening, and he had nearly died fighting against the orcs. Without hesitation, Kim had returned to the army and became a foundational member of AMT. In other words, Kim was a soldier through and through. Lee reflected that if he were to tell Kim that he had taken Kim's words as his own belief and had put his life on the line for his fellow soldiers, there was no way Kim would send Lee to the military. Just as Lee was thinking about this, Kim approached and placed his hands on Lee's shoulders. With a determined look, Kim told Lee that he was to become a non-commissioned officer. In that moment, the system notified Lee that the absorption was complete. Lee had met the special condition and earned a new skill. The skill was called Steel Physique, with a rank of D. Its effect was that it used 5 mana to temporarily strengthen a part of the body. The system also added that if Lee swallowed more than the fixed amount of high-hardness magic metal, the skill rank would increase. It further informed him that the weight of the metal he could currently manipulate was 2,558 grams. Lee, Min-hee, and Yunha were caught off guard by Kim's unexpected announcement, leaving them momentarily speechless. Lee, in particular, appeared deeply unsettled as the weight of Kim's words sank in, especially upon hearing that he would soon become a non-commissioned officer. The news visibly troubled him, his expression betraying the internal conflict he was grappling with. Not long after, in the training room of the 3rd Brigade, 1st Battalion Station, Lee could be found working out with an unusual intensity, as though he were trying to sweat out the unease that had taken root in his mind. With every movement, his thoughts churned over the predicament he found himself in. He had been hoping to steer clear of trouble, to avoid the possibility of ending up in the guardhouse, but now it seemed he had inadvertently stumbled into yet another challenging situation. As he mulled over his circumstances, the weight of the decision pressed on him like a looming shadow. Meanwhile, from across the room, Sang-guk and Won-suk observed Lee with calculating eyes. They exchanged glances, their expressions darkening with a shared, unspoken understanding. A sinister grin spread across their faces as they silently signaled their intent to cause trouble for Lee, their demeanor hinting at malicious plans forming between them. As Lee paused for a brief rest, his thoughts drifted back to the earlier conversation that had unsettled him so deeply. He recalled how Manhwa, with a mix of urgency and concern, had spoken up on his behalf, pleading with Kim to reconsider the proposal. She had pointed out that Lee, being just an F rank, had never taken on the role of a non-commissioned officer within the AMT before. Her words had momentarily shielded him, giving him a reprieve to claim that he needed time to think about the matter. Lee knew he owed this temporary respite to platoon leader Lee Min-hee's timely intervention. However, as he reflected further, a serious expression settled on his face. He resolved that, for the time being, he would do his best to keep a low profile. Living like a mouse seemed to be the only viable strategy to avoid drawing Kim's attention again. With a determined yet wary demeanor, Lee resolved to tread cautiously, navigating his precarious situation as best as he could. As Lee was immersed in his thoughts, trying to make sense of his current predicament, Won-suk approached him. With an air of nonchalance, Won-suk asked if Lee was finished using the bench for his training. Lee, caught off guard by the sudden interruption, paused briefly before responding that he had not yet finished. Won-suk, upon hearing this, gave a menacing smile that did little to hide his true intentions. Lee, irritated by Won-suk's demeanor and sudden presence, questioned why Won-suk was there in the first place. Without missing a beat, Won-suk picked up the barbell near the bench. With a mocking tone, he commented on how Lee had recently gained some fame. He then added that it would be shameful for someone of Lee's status to train with such a light weight, suggesting that it was not only embarrassing for Lee but also for their entire unit since they shared the same affiliation. The taunt was calculated, loud enough to draw the attention of those in the room. As others began to turn their heads, a crowd started to gather, curious about the confrontation. Among them, Lee noticed Sang-guk standing with a group of his men. Their expressions bore a collective smugness, with Sang-guk's menacing smile standing out as the most prominent. In that instant, Lee understood the situation with crystal clarity. This was not a random encounter. It was Sang-guk's doing, orchestrated to provoke and humiliate Lee. Lee clenched his jaw as the weight of the situation bore down on him. He realized that if he tried to avoid Sang-guk now, it would only embolden him further. He would face the same relentless bullying as in his past life, and the prospect of dealing with such harassment again was already proving to be an annoyance. Knowing this, Lee steeled himself, understanding that evasion was no longer an option. Lee placed his hands on his head, his thoughts racing as he reflected on his earlier resolve to avoid drawing attention to himself. It was clear to him now that this approach would only make matters worse. If he continued down this path, Sang-guk and his group would relentlessly create trouble for him. Realizing the futility of trying to evade them, Lee decided in that moment that he needed to confront the issue head-on. After a brief pause, Lee spoke up. He stated that he had been feeling particularly annoyed and that Won-suk's approach had come at just the right time. Turning to face Won-suk, Lee's expression shifted to one of intense determination. With a sharp gaze and a furious demeanor, he announced that they were going to spar immediately. Won-suk and Sang-guk, hearing this unexpected challenge, were momentarily caught off guard by Lee's boldness. Shortly after, Lee and Won-suk stood in the octagon, both prepared for the upcoming sparring match. Hyunwook, now wearing his gloves, let a menacing smile creep across his face as he eyed Lee. His demeanor exuded confidence and arrogance as he declared his intention to teach Lee a lesson. Without wasting any more time, Hyunwook charged forward with full force and delivered a powerful punch aimed directly at Lee. The air around the octagon grew tense as the confrontation began to escalate. Outside the training arena, beneath the dim glow of the night, two players stood engaged in conversation. Warrant Officer Cheon wore an expression of disappointment as he reflected on the absence of Choi Yoon-jun, the celebrated ace of the military, who was currently away on vacation. He had looked forward to seeing the young prodigy in action, having heard countless stories about his remarkable talent and his potential to ascend to the rank of a sword saint. The prospect of witnessing such a rare and extraordinary skill had filled Officer Cheon with anticipation, and the realization that he would miss the opportunity left him visibly disheartened. The other player, observing Cheon's reaction, sought to shift the focus of the conversation. He acknowledged that while Sergeant Choi Yoon-jun was indeed the ace of the military, there was already talk of another rising talent being hailed as the future ace. He elaborated that this individual possessed the rare and formidable barbarian trait, a unique attribute that set them apart, and hinted at immense potential. Officer Cheon, hearing this, felt a spark of curiosity. The idea of a new contender with such a rare quality intrigued him, and he found himself wondering about the identity of this promising player. Sensing Cheon's growing interest, the other player decided to offer a suggestion. He noted that Cheon had traveled all this way, and it would be unfortunate for him to leave without experiencing something worthwhile. He proposed that they make the most of their time and step inside the arena for a closer look. With a tone of encouragement, he hinted that perhaps there was still something remarkable to be seen, even in the absence of Choi Yoon-jun. Officer Cheon, considering the proposal, seemed to agree, and together, the two prepared to enter the arena, their anticipation building as they walked toward the entrance. Inside the octagon, the clash between Lee and Hyunwook continued with mounting intensity. Hyunwook unleashed a relentless flurry of punches, each one aimed to corner Lee and force him into submission. Despite the difficulty of evading such an aggressive assault, Lee managed to dodge every strike with remarkable reflexes. However, as the fight progressed, Lee became acutely aware that he had been backed into a corner, limiting his options for escape. Sensing his advantage, Hyunwook seized the moment and delivered a powerful punch aimed directly at Lee. The suddenness of the attack startled Lee, but just as the blow was about to land, he narrowly dodged it by rolling out of harm's way. Regaining his footing, Lee stood tall and met Hyunwook's gaze with a taunting smirk. He challenged Hyunwook to give it everything he had, making it clear that what Hyunwook had shown so far would not be enough to defeat him. Hyunwook, already brimming with frustration, grew visibly enraged at what he perceived as Lee's arrogance. The intensity of the fight drew gasps and murmurs from the gathered spectators, who watched with rapt attention as the two combatants continued to push each other to their limits. The unexpected resilience and audacity Lee displayed left many in the crowd surprised, adding an air of unpredictability to the battle. Meanwhile, outside the octagon, Officer Cheon and the player who had accompanied him earlier stood among the onlookers, their focus now entirely on the fight unfolding before them. The other player turned to Officer Cheon and remarked that the scene felt almost as if it had been orchestrated specifically for him, likening the match to an audition meant to display the fighter's skills. Gesturing toward Hyunwook, he commented on the sheer force behind Hyunwook's strikes, noting how every punch seemed to carry significant weight and power. Officer Cheon, however, continued to observe the fight with a more critical eye. While others seemed impressed by Hyunwook's strength, Cheon's expression suggested a more nuanced opinion. His focus shifted momentarily to Lee, whose agility and composure under pressure seemed to catch his attention. As the fight raged on, Cheon's curiosity deepened, and he began to evaluate the fighters with the precision of someone accustomed to identifying true potential in the midst of chaos. Officer Cheon, observing the ongoing fight, turned to the other player and calmly remarked that Hyunwook's powerful punches were of little value if he could not manage to land even a single hit on his opponent. The other player, however, was quick to defend Hyunwook, explaining that his lack of precision stemmed from inexperience. He added confidently that if Hyunwook managed to connect with even one punch, the outcome would be like a grand slam, emphasizing the devastating power behind Hyunwook's strikes. Despite this reassurance, Officer Cheon remained skeptical, his critical assessment of Hyunwook's fighting skills unaffected by the other player's optimism. Meanwhile, the tension inside the arena began to rise. Sang-wook, frustrated with Hyunwook's inability to gain the upper hand, shouted from the sidelines. His voice cut through the noise as he demanded to know if Hyunwook had been holding back against Lee. Sang-wook criticized him sharply, pointing out that Lee had not sustained any real damage so far and urging Hyunwook to get serious and fight properly. The outburst drew attention from others in the crowd, and soon Sang-wook's companions joined in, echoing his sentiments. One of them shouted that sparring was no place for half-hearted effort, while another, clearly irritated, revealed that they had placed a bet on Hyunwook and insisted he start taking the fight seriously. Hyunwook, already struggling with his mounting frustration, felt the weight of their words pressing down on him. The chorus of shouts from Sang-wook and his group only served to stoke his anger further. Inside his mind, Hyunwook was seething. He knew that he had not been going easy on Lee at all and resented the implication. Despite his growing rage, Hyunwook could not shake an unsettling realization: his body felt strangely heavier than it had before. It was as though an invisible force was draining his usual strength and slowing him down. This unfamiliar sensation gnawed at him, adding another layer of unease to the mounting pressure he faced. Determined to prove himself, Hyunwook clenched his fists, preparing to launch another assault, but the uncertainty in his body lingered, casting a shadow over his confidence. Hyunwook, determined to turn the tide of the fight, charged at Lee with all his might, aiming to overwhelm him with sheer force. However, as he moved, Lee subtly activated his skill, targeting the metal components in Hyunwook's boots. With precise mental control, Lee manipulated the metal, increasing its weight and significantly slowing Hyunwook's movements. As this unseen force took effect, Lee observed his opponent closely, thinking that Hyunwook must now feel as though he were trudging through a thick swamp. The prediction proved accurate, as Hyunwook began to falter with every step, his movements growing heavier and more labored by the second. Confusion spread across Hyunwook's face as he struggled to understand what was happening. The unnatural sluggishness in his legs left him feeling both alarmed and frustrated. Pausing briefly in the middle of the fight, Hyunwook tried to regain his composure and called out to Lee, stating that something felt off with his legs. Lee, however, seized the opportunity to press his advantage. With a menacing smile, he coldly questioned why he should stop the fight just because things were no longer going in Hyunwook's favor. The comment struck a nerve, and Hyunwook's frustration boiled over. Fueled by anger and a bruised ego, Hyunwook cursed Lee for his cockiness and decided to pull out his trump card. With a roar, he activated his body-strengthening berserk mode, a skill designed to enhance his physical capabilities to an extraordinary degree. Instantly, Hyunwook's body underwent a dramatic transformation, growing larger and more muscular, his strength increasing exponentially. The sheer power radiating from him was enough to send ripples of tension through the arena, and the spectators watched with wide-eyed amazement at the sight of his overwhelming form. Lee, witnessing Hyunwook's transformation, dropped his confident smile. His expression shifted to one of seriousness as he realized that this fight was about to reach an entirely new level. The playful advantage he had been leveraging moments ago was now overshadowed by the sheer brute force that Hyunwook possessed. The shift in the atmosphere did not go unnoticed by Officer Cheon, who stood among the crowd, observing the fight with growing interest. Cheon's eyes narrowed as he recognized the implications of Hyunwook's berserk mode. He noted that with Hyunwook activating body strengthening, the fight had escalated beyond the boundaries of a mere sparring session. It had become something far more intense and dangerous. Yet, what truly caught Cheon off guard was Lee's unflinching demeanor. Despite the transformation before him, Lee's gaze remained steady and unshaken. Cheon found himself comparing the scene to a battle between an enraged buffalo, charging forward with raw power, and a calculating leopard, whose hidden fangs promised a deadly counterattack. The clash of these two contrasting forces created a palpable tension in the arena, leaving the spectators and Cheon alike in anticipation of the next move, as the fight teetered on the brink of explosive escalation. Officer Cheon, intently observing the heated battle between the two fighters, remarked to the other player that the fight had taken a fascinating turn. His interest was undeniable, his gaze fixed on the octagon as the tension between Lee and Hyunwook escalated. The other player, equally engrossed, nodded in agreement and reminded Cheon of his earlier assessment. He reiterated that Hyunwook was no ordinary fighter, highlighting that the young man had lived up to the rumors of being called the future ace. The player added with a note of pride that Hyunwook was only a D-ranker and already proficient in the use of body strengthening, a skill far beyond the reach of most fighters at his level. Inside the octagon, Hyunwook's confidence burned brightly as he faced Lee, his transformed form radiating raw power. He declared that the fight would end there and then, determined to prove his dominance. Without hesitation, Hyunwook launched himself at Lee with incredible speed, channeling all of his enhanced strength into a devastating attack. The blow connected with explosive force, sending Lee hurtling backward across the octagon and slamming into the corner with a resounding impact. The crowd erupted into cheers at the sight, their excitement reaching a fever pitch. Sanguk, standing with his group, couldn't contain his satisfaction and loudly praised Hyunwook for his performance. He declared that Hyunwook's power was on full display and that Lee didn't stand a chance against such overwhelming strength. Others in the audience echoed his sentiments, marveling at Hyunwook's abilities and acknowledging that his title as the future ace was well-deserved. They remarked on how Hyunwook seemed to be operating on an entirely different level, far beyond what they had expected to see in the sparring match. Amid the growing celebration, Hyunwook stood tall, basking in the glory of his apparent victory. However, as he replayed the moment of impact in his mind, a nagging sensation began to unsettle him. His expression shifted as he flexed his hand, replaying the moment he struck Lee. Something was off, something he couldn't ignore. The instant his fist had connected, it felt as though he had struck solid steel with his bare hand. The shock that reverberated through his body was unnatural, and the sensation left his knuckles throbbing slightly. Confusion began to creep into Hyunwook's thoughts as he glanced toward Lee, who was now slowly rising to his feet. Hyunwook's brow furrowed, and doubt began to gnaw at the edges of his confidence. The attack he had delivered with such force should have ended the fight, yet Lee was not only still standing but appeared to be regaining his composure with an unnerving calmness. The cheers of the crowd faded into the background as Hyunwook's mind raced to make sense of what had just occurred, a flicker of unease sparking in the depths of his rage-fueled determination. At that moment, the system interface appeared before Lee, displaying a notification about the skill Hyunwook had activated. It informed him that the ability used was strengthening body transformation, a D-rank skill designed to temporarily enhance a specific part of the body. The system further detailed that the skill consumed 5 units of mana per activation and hinted at a method to increase its rank, consuming a certain quantity of magic metals. As Lee read through the information, a menacing smile crept across his face. He realized that he, too, had activated the very same skill. Strengthening body transformation was now coursing through him, and he had fortified his hands to withstand the devastating force of Hyunwook's earlier attack. With his confidence bolstered, Lee turned his gaze toward Hyunwook, his smile carrying a mocking edge. In that moment, he taunted Hyunwook, daring him to strike again. Hyunwook, already seething with frustration, was further incensed by Lee's audacious attitude. His anger boiled over, and he roared furiously, declaring that Lee was nothing more than a worthless F-ranker who had no place standing against him. Fueled by rage, Hyunwook resolved to end the fight decisively and charged toward Lee with another powerful attack. As Hyunwook lunged forward, channeling all his strength into the strike, Lee moved with precision and agility. Anticipating the attack, he sidestepped effortlessly, avoiding the blow with an almost casual ease. In that fleeting moment, Lee saw an opening and decided to counter. His movements were swift and calculated, each step guided by the sharpened instincts he had developed through both experience and his system-enhanced abilities. As he prepared to unleash his counterattack, a thought crossed Lee's mind. He couldn't help but find the use of a skill like strengthening body transformation on someone like Hyunwook to be a waste of effort and energy. Yet, he rationalized, there was a purpose to this display. People like Hyunwook, who flaunted their strength recklessly and treated others with arrogance, needed to be taught a lesson. In Lee's view, putting them in their place was the only effective way to cure their inflated egos. With that thought in mind, Lee activated the skill again, this time focusing the enhancement on his legs. Feeling the surge of power coursing through him, he delivered a forceful and precise kick aimed directly at Hyunwook's legs. The impact was devastating, knocking Hyunwook off balance and sending him crashing to the ground. The audience gasped in shock as the once dominant fighter was brought low in an instant. Lee, not one to miss an opportunity, followed up with another calculated move. As Hyunwook struggled to regain his footing, Lee delivered a powerful punch directly to Hyunwook's face, the force of the blow reverberating through the arena. The audience was momentarily stunned into silence before murmurs of astonishment began to ripple through the crowd. Lee stood over his opponent, his expression calm but resolute, a clear signal that he would not tolerate the arrogance and disrespect that Hyunwook had so brazenly displayed. As Hyunwook lay on the floor, struggling to regain his bearings, Lee unleashed a relentless barrage of punches. Each strike landed with precision, and Hyunwook, still attempting to protect himself from the overwhelming assault, could only shield his face. The onlookers, who had been watching the fight unfold, were stunned to witness Lee gaining the upper hand and dominating Hyunwook in such a brutal manner. The balance of the fight had clearly shifted, and the crowd's disbelief was palpable. However, amidst the surprise, Officer Cheon stood in the audience with a subtle smile creeping across his face. He understood something that others did not. Lee had finally revealed his true nature in the fight. It was clear that Lee was no longer just defending himself, he was now actively fighting back with the ferocity of a predator. Officer Cheon's smile, however, soon faded as his expression shifted to one of intense focus. He knew that if Lee truly was a beast, there was no way he would let go of Hyunwook's neck now that he had the upper hand. The thought of it sent a chill through him as he silently wished for Lee to finish the fight and take Hyunwook's life. At that exact moment, just as Lee was poised to deliver the final blow, Hyunwook's fury erupted. With an explosive burst of strength, he managed to push himself up from the ground and grab Lee by the collar, his face bruised and bloodied from the earlier punches. His eyes burned with rage as he glared at Lee, his voice thick with venom as he spat out that Lee was nothing more than a filthy bastard. He was unable to fathom the tricks Lee had used to gain the upper hand, but one thing was certain in his mind, he was going to make Lee pay. With a ferocious roar, Hyunwook hurled Lee to the ground with all his might, intending to crush him and put an end to the fight once and for all. The force of the throw reverberated through the air, and the crowd could feel the tension rise as the outcome of the fight hung in the balance. Just as Lee was about to crash to the ground, his instincts kicked in, and he moved with lightning speed. In a split second, he managed to grab hold of Hyunwook's arm, locking it in a flying armbar that caught Hyunwook completely off guard. The sudden shift in the fight left the audience stunned, as Hyunwook struggled against the submission, trying to break free with all his might. The pressure on his arm was intense, and his face twisted in pain as he fought to escape. Officer Cheon, watching the exchange closely, couldn't help but think to himself that had Hyunwook managed to land that final, crushing punch before the armbar was applied, he would have likely shattered Lee's arm right then and there. However, to Cheon's surprise, Hyunwook proved his agility once again, swiftly stopping just short of having his arm broken. The sheer speed and reflexes Hyunwook displayed in that moment earned Officer Cheon's respect, and he silently acknowledged Hyunwook's skill and resilience. As Lee continued to apply the submission, Officer Cheon's thoughts turned to the larger picture. He knew Hyunwook was a barbarian, a powerhouse whose body was enhanced through strengthening techniques. Cheon began to question whether Lee, a mere ordinary fighter, stood a real chance against Hyunwook's raw strength and battle-hardened endurance. He wondered if he had perhaps overestimated Lee's abilities and given him too much credit. As the fight progressed, Cheon couldn't help but feel a growing doubt that Lee would ultimately prevail. Hyunwook, struggling with the armbar, gritted his teeth and taunted Lee, his voice thick with disdain. He mocked Lee, telling him that his weak attack wouldn't be enough to crush his arm and that he was wasting his time trying. With a snarl, Hyunwook used his free hand to lash out at Lee, determined to break free and end the fight once and for all. However, just as Hyunwook was about to land a blow, Lee displayed incredible reflexes. In a split second, he released his hold on Hyunwook's arm and slipped behind him, seamlessly transitioning into another submission, this time a rear naked choke. The sudden shift in control took everyone by surprise as Lee expertly locked Hyunwook in the chokehold, his arms tightening around Hyunwook's neck, and the fight was far from over. That's all for today. Thanks for watching.